The house smelled of lavender, just as it always had. Ella stood in the grand foyer of her grandmother's Victorian home, the one that had been promised to her since she was a little girl. The house that, until a few days ago, had felt like her anchor in a world that often seemed too chaotic. Now, it felt like a cold, lifeless monument to memories she was about to lose forever. Her fingers tightened around the envelope she held, the one that had arrived just this morning, marked with strict instructions, open after the will reading. Her grandmother's final words echoed in her mind, sometimes, the biggest betrayals come wrapped in the most beautiful packages, dear. Ella hadn't understood then. But standing here, watching her family swarm around, greed in their eyes, she felt the full weight of those words. Her mother, Caroline, with her perfectly manicured hands, reached out to grab the house keys. "It's all for you, honey," Caroline said with that saccharine sweetness that always made Ella's skin crawl. "The house needs too many repairs. We're just trying to protect you from all that responsibility." Ella's stomach churned. "Protect me?" Her voice caught in her throat as she stared at her mother, then her father, Thomas, who was looking everywhere but her eyes. "By selling it without telling me?" She almost shouted, but the words stuck. Her brother, Max, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed in that way he always did when he was trying to be dismissive. "Come on, Ella. You can't even afford the property taxes," he muttered, as if the words could somehow ease the sting of betrayal. The air around her seemed to thicken, suffocating her as the familiar scent of her grandmother's lavender sachets clung to the room. Just 3 weeks ago, they'd shared tea in this very room, her grandmother telling stories about her youth, about the time when life had felt simpler, purer. Now, Ella stood in the midst of vultures, watching them pick apart her grandmother's legacy. "You can't do this," Ella whispered, her voice trembling. "Grand left it to me." Her words, desperate and filled with disbelief, hung in the air, but no one seemed to hear them. "It's in the will," Caroline snapped, her tone colder now. Actually, Ella's sister, Sophie, spoke up, breaking the silence with a disinterested tone. "Mom and Dad have power of attorney. The sale's already gone through." Ella's heart stopped. "What sale?" "We found a lovely buyer," Caroline continued, smoothing the fabric of her designer blouse as if this were some casual transaction. "He offered well above market value. The papers are signed." She didn't even look at Ella as she spoke, the words falling from her lips as though she were discussing the sale of a mere object. Ella's hand shook, her fingers clenching tighter around the envelope. She hadn't opened it yet. It had arrived by courier with those clear instructions: do not open until after the will reading. "Get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Ella," her father finally spoke, his voice cold and dismissive. "We're family. We're doing this for you." "Family?" The word struck Ella like a slap. "Family doesn't do this." Her laughter was sharp, bitter. "Get out of my grandmother's house now." One by one, they filed out, Caroline pausing at the door with a faint smile. "We're meeting the buyer tomorrow to hand over the keys. You should come. Maybe you can make peace with it." Ella stood frozen, the words cutting through her like ice. She waited until the door clicked shut behind them, leaving her alone in the empty house, the silence deafening. Her legs gave way, and she sank onto her grandmother's favorite armchair. The one with the faded floral pattern that still held the warmth of her presence. She tore open the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, and a small key. "My dearest Ella. If you are reading this, it means they've done exactly what I feared they would. But don't worry. I've left you something they don't know about. Something that will help you fight back. Check behind the loose brick in the garden wall, the one with the heart carved into it." Ella's heart pounded in her chest. The key. The brick. Her grandmother had been prepared for this. Ella stood up abruptly, the old chair creaking beneath her. She moved toward the back door, the key heavy in her hand. Her grandmother had known. She had known what they would try to do. And now, Ella was ready to uncover the truth. Ella stepped into the cold garden, the wind biting at her skin as she walked toward the wall. Her grandmother's house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now seemed to hold 1,000 secrets beneath its layers of dust and faded paint. With each step, Ella felt the weight of the envelope in her hand, the key pressing against her palm like a reminder of the battle ahead. As she reached the wall, Ella's eyes scanned the bricks, searching for the one her grandmother had mentioned. It didn't take long before she found it, the loose brick with a small, worn heart carved into it. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what she was about to uncover, but something inside her pushed her forward. With trembling hands, she pried the brick from its place, revealing a small compartment hidden behind it. Her breath caught as she pulled out a few yellowed documents. She quickly sifted through them, her heart pounding in her chest as she realized they weren't just any papers, they were crucial pieces of evidence. Her grandmother had left her not only a key, but a trail to uncover the truth. The documents were contracts, letters, and financial records, each one detailing her family's deceit. Her fingers shook as she flipped through the pages. There, at the very bottom of the pile, was a letter addressed to her grandmother, detailing a secret deal between Caroline, Thomas, and a mysterious buyer. The buyer's name, Edward Jackson, was boldly written at the top, and there was no mistaking the sinister tone of the letter. The deal, it seemed, had been in the works long before Ella had even known about it. Ella's mind raced, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Her grandmother had known they would try to sell the house without her consent. She had planned for this moment, meticulously gathering evidence to expose the truth. But as the cold air stung her cheeks, Ella realized she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone who understood the law and could fight back against her family's manipulation. Ella quickly made her way inside, her mind already on the next step. She needed to see someone she could trust. As the front door creaked shut behind her, she grabbed her phone and dialed the number she had been given for a lawyer. Skylar Martinez. The name had been mentioned during the will reading, and Ella felt an odd sense of comfort in the idea of contacting her. Skylar was calm, composed, exactly what Ella needed right now. The phone rang twice before Skylar's voice answered, smooth and professional. Skylar Martinez. How can I help you? I need your help, Ella said, her voice more urgent than she had intended. I found something. Something that could prove my family forged my signature. They sold my grandmother's house without my consent. Skylar's response was immediate, her voice sharp and focused. Meet me in my office. Bring everything you have, and we'll take it from there. The adrenaline that had been building in Ella all day surged as she hung up the phone. She had the documents, the evidence, and now she had a plan. But as she raced to gather the papers, another thought crossed her mind. Before I share what happened next, the moment that left an entire room of journalists in stunned silence, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button, because this story is just getting started. Ella grabbed the final document, slipping it into her bag before heading out the door. She could feel the weight of the fight ahead, but she also knew, deep down, that she was no longer fighting alone. She had the truth on her side, and that was a force stronger than anything her family could throw at her. As she stepped into the night, the cold wind no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a challenge. And Ella was ready to face it head-on. Ella's heart raced as she walked into Skylar's office the next day. The sleek, modern space felt like a world away from the dusty old house she had just left. The calm, composed lawyer sat behind her desk, flipping through the documents Ella had brought. She raised an eyebrow as she glanced over the stack, her expression unreadable. You've got everything we need, Skylar said, her voice steady. We can use this to stop the sale, but it's not going to be easy. Your family won't just give up. They'll fight you at every turn. Ella swallowed hard, the weight of the fight ahead settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had known her family wasn't going to back down, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. Still, the thought of losing the house, the one thing that had always felt like home, was too much to bear. She had to see this through. Then we fight, Ella said, her voice more certain than she felt. Skylar nodded, her eyes gleaming with a mix of respect and determination. We start by confronting them, Skylar replied, sliding the documents back into a folder. You need to show them that you're not backing down. Ella nodded. The confrontation was inevitable. She had already made up her mind. She couldn't let her family steal everything her grandmother had left her without a fight. The plan was simple. Ella would meet her family at the lawyer's office, present the forged documents, and demand that they stop the sale. The moment they saw the evidence, they would have no choice but to back down, or so she hoped. When Ella arrived at the office, her family was already there. Caroline sat at one end of the table, her fingers delicately tapping against the surface, her face a mask of practiced calm. Thomas sat beside her, staring out the window with his usual detached air. Max stood by the door, arms crossed, looking like he was already preparing for a battle. Sophie, however, looked uneasy, her eyes darting from one family member to the other. As Ella walked in, her presence seemed to freeze the room. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of her family's expectations, their anticipation of how she would react. They thought they could control her. They thought she would let them take what was rightfully hers. But they had underestimated her. I've got something to show you, Ella said, her voice cutting through the silence. She pulled the folder from her bag and slammed it onto the table, the sound sharp and final. Caroline's eyes narrowed, her smile fading. Ella, don't do this. You don't understand what's at stake. No, you don't understand, Ella shot back, her voice rising. This house was never just a building to me. It was my grandmother's legacy, and you're trying to take that away. Max rolled his eyes, clearly dismissive. Ella, this is about money. We're just trying to protect you from the burden. You can't afford it. But Ella wasn't listening. She opened the folder and slid the forged documents across the table. The signature was glaringly fake, a clear sign that someone had signed on her behalf without her consent. Her name was there, yes, but it wasn't her handwriting. And there was no denying that she had been out of state the day the sale had been finalized. This is your signature, right? Skylar asked, her voice calm but authoritative. Caroline's eyes flickered with panic, and Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. It's forged, Ella said, her voice cold. I never signed these papers. You sold the house behind my back. Sophie's face turned pale as she looked from Ella to the documents, her expression torn. She had always been the quiet one, the one who stayed out of family arguments, but now, she was staring at the evidence of her parents' betrayal. I didn't sign it either, Caroline said, her voice tight with anger. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what's best for you. You mean what's best for you, Ella shot back, standing taller now, feeling the weight of her grandmother's words in her chest. She had to finish this. You've been planning this for months, haven't you? Selling the house behind my back, and now you want to play the victim? Max stepped forward, his face flushed with frustration. Ella, don't make this harder than it has to be. We're doing this for the family. The family? Ella's laugh was bitter. You're not doing this for the family, Max. You're doing this for yourselves. You're doing this to cover up your lies. Sophie stood up suddenly, her hands trembling. Enough, she said quietly, her voice breaking the tension. I can't do this anymore. Her eyes locked onto Ella's. I've known for a while, Ella. I found the emails. I found the documents. I couldn't bring myself to tell you. But now I can't keep pretending. The words hung in the air, heavy and painful. Caroline's face twisted in anger, but there was something else in her eyes now, something darker, more desperate. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair over in the process. This is not your decision, Sophie. Caroline's voice was sharp, but Sophie didn't back down. Maybe it should be, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned to Ella, her eyes filled with guilt. I'm sorry. Ella didn't know what to say. She had never expected this from her sister, but in that moment, something inside her shifted. Maybe there was hope for redemption after all. With a deep breath, Ella turned back to Skylar. We need to stop the sale. We need to make sure they can't get away with this. Skylar nodded, her eyes focused. We'll get the police involved if we have to. But first, let's make sure they know that you're not backing down. Ella glanced at her family one last time, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. The house is mine, she said, her voice unwavering. And I'll fight for it. No matter what. The room was silent, but for the first time, Ella felt like she had the upper hand. Her fight wasn't over yet, but she was ready to see it through. Ella stood in the dimly lit office, the weight of the documents pressing down on her chest. She had faced her family, confronted their lies, and now, it was time to uncover the truth. Skylar had arranged a meeting with the buyer, Edward Jackson, who was unaware of the deception that had been carefully woven around him. As the door opened and Edward stepped inside, Ella felt a pang of unease. His confident stride and tailored suit contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. Mr. Jackson, Skylar said smoothly, gesturing for him to take a seat. We need to talk about the house. Edward looked at Ella, then back at Skylar. I assumed everything was in order. Your mother assured me the sale was final. Ella's heart sank as her mother's voice echoed in her mind. You'll have to trust me, Ella. This is for the best. But Ella knew better now. This wasn't for her benefit. It never had been. She had seen the emails, the forged documents, and now, she was ready to expose everything. I'm afraid that's not the case, Skylar said, her voice calm but firm. The sale is not valid. Ella never signed the papers. Edward's brow furrowed, clearly taken aback. What do you mean? My lawyer assured me. Skylar slid a copy of the forged documents across the desk. This is supposed to be Ella's signature, but as you can see, it's a clear forgery. Ella was in Seattle the day the documents were signed. She couldn't have possibly authorized this sale. Edward's face went pale as the realization began to sink in. His gaze flickered between Ella and Skylar, but he couldn't deny the truth that was laid out in front of him. I didn't know, he muttered, his voice filled with confusion. I was told you'd agreed to this. They told me you just couldn't be here for the signing. No, Ella interrupted sharply, her voice colder than she had intended. I never agreed to this. You were lied to, Mr. Jackson. She could see the shift in his demeanor, his confidence faltering as the weight of the situation hit him. He was starting to realize that he had been duped, just like Ella had been. I had no idea about any of this, Edward said, rubbing his temples. This wasn't the deal I was presented with. I thought everything was above board. It wasn't, Ella replied quietly, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. She had known that her family would try to justify their actions, but to see it all fall apart in front of her eyes felt strangely cathartic. Skylar leaned forward, her fingers tapping on the desk. There's more. We've discovered emails between your family and potential buyers. It seems they've been trying to sell the house for months, without Ella's knowledge or consent. Edward looked at the papers Skylar laid out in front of him, his eyes widening as he scanned through the messages. He muttered to himself as the pieces started to fall into place. Your mother mentioned there might be resistance, Edward said, reading aloud from one of the emails. She said Ella was too emotionally attached to the house to see the financial opportunity. Ella's stomach churned at the words. She had never imagined her mother would refer to her grandmother's home, the one place she had always felt safe, as merely a financial opportunity. The betrayal ran deeper than she had realized. This is unbelievable, Edward whispered, his voice barely audible. I had no idea this was going on. I was told everything was fine. Ella couldn't help the bitterness that crept into her voice. Of course you weren't told. They knew exactly how to manipulate you, how to manipulate all of us. Skylar nodded, her expression serious. We have enough evidence here to prove that the sale was fraudulent. And if it's proven that your signature was forged, the sale can be reversed. Edward looked between Skylar and Ella, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. What do you need me to do? We need a formal statement from you, Skylar replied. Your confirmation that you were led to believe everything was above board, that you were told Ella had agreed to the sale, even though it wasn't true. Edward hesitated but finally nodded. I'll make the statement. I can't be a part of this anymore. I had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes. Ella felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. There was still so much to uncover, so much more that her family had kept hidden. As Edward stood to leave, Skylar handed him the statement to sign, and the weight of the situation began to sink in for both of them. You're doing the right thing, Skylar said, offering him a reassuring smile. But Ella couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at her. There was still one more thing to discover, something her grandmother had left behind, something more than just evidence of forgery and lies. As Edward left the office, Ella turned to Skylar, her voice quiet but urgent. There's something else. My grandmother, she knew what they were doing. I don't think this is just about the house. There's something hidden inside. Something my family doesn't want me to find. Skylar looked at her with a mix of curiosity and caution. What do you mean? Ella hesitated but then spoke, her voice steady. I found a key. A small one, hidden in a letter. And I think it leads to something important. I don't know what it is yet, but I have to find it. Skylar nodded, her face unreadable. We'll find it. And when we do, we'll have all the proof we need. As Ella left the office, her heart raced again. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together, but she knew the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. And this time, she was ready to face whatever it was, no matter how dark the secrets of her family might be. The day of the final confrontation arrived, and Ella's heart beat faster with every step she took toward the Riverside Hotel. Skylar had arranged for a meeting with her family, and this time, there would be no more pretending. The evidence was clear. The lies were exposed. The fight for her grandmother's legacy was about to reach its breaking point. Ella couldn't help but feel the weight of the battle on her shoulders. Her mind raced with thoughts of the emails, the forged signatures, and the evidence they had gathered. But more than anything, she kept thinking about her grandmother's final words, sometimes, the biggest betrayals come wrapped in the most beautiful packages. Ella had been blind to the truth for too long, but now she saw it all clearly. Her family had been playing a dangerous game, and she was no longer willing to let them win. As Ella entered the hotel room, the tension was palpable. Caroline sat at the head of the table, her usual composure replaced by a sharp, almost frantic edge. Thomas stood by the window, his back to the room, his arms folded across his chest as if he could somehow shut out the truth. Max leaned against the wall, his eyes darting nervously between Ella and Skylar. Sophie was sitting at the far end of the table, looking uncomfortable, her eyes downcast. She had chosen to speak the truth, but Ella knew there was still a long road ahead before she could fully trust her again. We need to talk, Ella said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet fury. She was done being the victim. Done being silent. This was her moment. Caroline's eyes flickered, a mixture of guilt and anger flashing across her face. Ella, you're making a mistake, she said, trying to mask her panic with a false calm. You don't understand what's at stake here. We did this for you, for the family. Ella took a step forward, her voice unwavering. For me? Is that why you sold the house behind my back? Is that why you forged my signature and manipulated everyone around you? Max stepped forward, his voice laced with frustration. Ella, stop. You're making this harder than it has to be. We didn't want to do this. But we had no choice. No choice? Ella's laugh was bitter. You always had a choice. You chose to betray me. You chose to betray everything my grandmother stood for. Thomas finally spoke, his voice soft but heavy with regret. We didn't want this to happen. But the business, everything we worked for, it was falling apart. We were desperate. Ella turned her gaze toward him, her eyes cold. You were desperate, so you decided to steal my inheritance? You decided to sell the one thing that meant something to me? Sophie finally spoke, her voice trembling. Ella, I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't want any of this. But I found out about the forgeries. I saw the emails. I couldn't just stay quiet anymore. Ella's breath caught. For the first time, Sophie wasn't hiding behind her silence. She was taking responsibility. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. We're all part of this mess, Max said, his voice quiet now. But we did what we thought we had to. The business was failing. Dad made bad investments. Bad investments? Ella's voice shook with disbelief. Is that what you're calling it? Fraud, theft, and lies? You stole from me, from our family, and you're trying to justify it by blaming bad investments? Skylar, who had been silent until now, finally stood up, her expression sharp. Enough. Ella's right. This isn't just about the house. This is about the years of deception and fraud that you've been hiding. And the fact that you thought you could get away with it. Caroline stood abruptly, her hands trembling. You don't know what you're talking about. This is a family matter. You have no right to. Skylar's voice cut through the air. I have every right to expose the truth. And the truth is, you've been lying, manipulating, and stealing for years. You've used this family for your own gain. Ella's eyes never left her mother's face. She saw the cracks in Caroline's perfect facade, the way her carefully constructed world was starting to unravel. Caroline's anger was boiling over, but it was fear that made her eyes wild now. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being exposed for the fraud she was. You're not going to get away with this, Ella said quietly, her voice steady. The police are already involved. The documents are in order, and we have all the evidence we need to prove you forged my signature, that you sold the house behind my back, and that you've been hiding stolen artwork from my grandmother's collection. Caroline's face drained of color. What artwork? She spat, trying to mask her panic with defiance. The artwork hidden behind the walls of the house, Skylar said, her tone cold. The paintings your family has been laundering for years. The paintings that your mother, Ella's grandmother, knew about, and was trying to protect. Max's face twisted in horror. No, he said hoarsely. No, that's not. But it is, Ella interrupted, her voice filled with quiet strength. My grandmother knew what you were doing. She knew you were hiding the art, hiding the truth. That's why she changed her will, that's why she left everything to me, to make sure none of you could destroy what mattered. Thomas, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke, his voice breaking. We never wanted this. We didn't want to hurt anyone. But we were desperate. Ella shook her head, the sting of their words still fresh. You hurt everyone, and you hurt me the most. But it's over now. You can't hide anymore. Everything's coming to light. As the weight of her words hung in the air, the sound of sirens grew louder outside, signaling the end of the road for her family. The police were here. It was over. Ella took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the fight she had just won, but knowing that the hardest part was still ahead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe. The truth had finally come out. And in that moment, Ella knew that whatever happened next, she had won. The house, her grandmother's legacy, was hers. And she would make sure it stayed that way, no matter what. The police sirens grew louder, signaling the end of the road for Ella's family. She stood in the hotel room, holding her grandmother's leather-bound journal. The truth was out, and the weight of the moment settled over her like a heavy cloak. I found something, Ella began, her voice steady. My grandmother knew everything. She left me this to expose the truth. She opened the journal, reading aloud the final entry, You've exposed the truth, while protecting what matters most, our family's real legacy. Ella's eyes burned as she looked at her family. Her grandmother had prepared her for this. This isn't just about the house, Ella continued. It's about the lies, the stolen art, the years of deception. Skylar stepped forward, her voice firm. Ella's right. We have enough evidence to prove everything, the forgery, the fraud, the hidden artwork. And the police are already here. Caroline and Thomas remained silent, their faces pale. Max and Sophie shifted uncomfortably, but Sophie finally spoke up. I knew. I saw the emails, the forgeries. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I'm sorry, Ella. Ella nodded, but her voice remained resolute. Sorry doesn't fix this. But it's a start. At that moment, the police entered, confirming everything. We have enough to move forward with charges, one officer said. They took statements, beginning with Sophie. Ella's family had lost. She had won. The house, her grandmother's legacy, was safe. The truth had been revealed, and nothing could take it back. The weight lifted from Ella's shoulders as she turned to Skylar. It's over, Ella said quietly. Skylar smiled. You did it. You protected her legacy. Ella stood by the window, watching as the last of the police cars drove away. The future was uncertain, but she knew one thing: her grandmother's legacy would endure, untouched by the lies that had once tried to destroy it. And with that, Ella finally felt free. The aftermath of the trial felt like a weight lifted, but the scars remained. Caroline and Thomas had been convicted of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Their business crumbled under the weight of their lies, and the stolen artwork was returned, just as Ella's grandmother had predicted. Sophie had cooperated, offering her full statement, but Ella couldn't shake the feeling that it was too little too late. Sophie had stayed silent for too long, but Ella chose to believe her apology was sincere. Max, however, remained distant. His refusal to accept responsibility for his role in the deception left Ella cold. For now, she couldn't bring herself to forgive him. The betrayal stung too deeply. The legal battle was long, but Ella stood firm, armed with the truth. Her parents pled guilty and would serve time, but the damage was done. The family was shattered. Ella sat in her grandmother's sunroom, finally feeling some peace. The house, once tainted with betrayal, was starting to feel like home again. The art was restored, and each piece told a story of resilience. Sophie came to visit, her voice full of regret. Ella, I want to make things right. I'll testify against them. I'm sorry for everything. Ella didn't respond with forgiveness, but she did acknowledge her sister's efforts. I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I believe you're trying now. That's all I can ask for. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The house, her grandmother's legacy, was finally safe, and Ella knew that, despite the pain, she had reclaimed what was rightfully hers. The future was hers to rebuild, stronger than ever. As the months passed, the weight of the past began to lift, but the scars would always remain. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, had become a place of healing. Ella had spent countless hours restoring it, breathing new life into every room, every corner. Her grandmother's presence seemed to linger in the walls, a reminder of the strength it had taken to protect the legacy she had left behind. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, Ella stood in the sunroom, sipping tea from her grandmother's favorite cup. It felt peaceful now, almost like the house had come alive again. The art, once hidden and forgotten, now hung proudly on the walls, each piece telling its own story. Ella had found a way to make the house her own, not just in terms of ownership, but in spirit. It was a place where she could honor her grandmother's memory and start anew. Sophie visited more frequently now, her visits no longer filled with the tension they once had. They still had a long way to go, but something had shifted. Sophie had taken responsibility for her part, and that made all the difference. The bond between them wasn't fully healed, but Ella had learned that forgiveness didn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes, it was just about understanding and moving forward. One evening, as they sat together in the sunroom, Sophie looked at Ella with a thoughtful expression. You know, Grandma would have been proud of you, she said quietly. Ella smiled, the warmth of her grandmother's memory filling her heart. I like to think she would have been. Her gaze drifted to the garden outside, the sun setting in the distance. She always believed in doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. I guess I learned that from her. Sophie nodded, her eyes softening. I think you've done more than that. You've taken something broken and made it whole again. Ella's heart swelled. She had fought for the house, yes, but it was so much more than that. She had fought for her grandmother's legacy, for the truth, and for the chance to rebuild a future, not just for herself, but for her family, in whatever way that could still be salvaged. Later that night, as Ella stood at the front door, looking out at the house she had worked so hard to restore, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The past was never going to be completely erased, but it no longer controlled her. She had found the strength to move forward, to create something new, something real. With a deep breath, Ella turned away from the door and walked back inside, her footsteps echoing through the quiet halls. The house was hers, but it was more than that. It was her new beginning. A place where she could heal, rebuild, and finally live the life her grandmother had always hoped for her. Ella had fought for the truth, for the legacy, and now she was ready to embrace the future, knowing that whatever came next, she was stronger than ever before. The house, once a symbol of loss, had become a symbol of resilience. And for the first time in a long time, Ella felt like she was finally home.